Snakes are among the most feared creatures on Earth, and for good reason. Each year, nearly 100,000 people lose their lives to snake bites. In this video, we're diving into some of the most horrifying snake attacks ever recorded. Let's get started right away. It was a quiet morning on August 2, 2012 at William Martin's home in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Known as Marty to those close to him, William had spent his life immersed in the study of timber rattlesnakes. At 80 years old, he was considered a leading authority in herpetology. His career, built on a deep passion for the venomous snakes of the Bull Run Mountains, had earned him respect across the scientific community. Marty had developed a fascination with snakes as a child. At just 13 years old, while exploring the Bull Run Mountains, he made a remarkable discovery: a population of timber rattlesnakes never before documented. He convinced Dr. Leslie Bearer, a professional herpetologist, to visit the area and confirm his findings. This early encounter ignited a lifelong pursuit. Despite his small stature, Marty's tenacity led him to document snake populations across the globe. In his 20s, he co-founded the Virginia Herpetological Society and earned a degree in biology from the University of South Florida after serving as a paratrooper in Vietnam. Over the years, Marty had encountered many rattlesnake bites. While some were dry, others left their mark. The pain was always searing, spreading from the bite site and weakening his body. But his resilience never faltered. He continued to handle timber rattlesnakes, pushing through the discomfort to further his research. Though rare, venomous snake bites can prove deadly, especially for the very young, the elderly, or those with weakened immune systems. Rattlesnake strikes are fast, capable of traveling 6.5 miles per hour, covering up to 3 feet in the blink of an eye. Despite his knowledge and experience, Marty's luck was about to run out. On that morning in 2012, Marty was at home as he had been countless times before, preparing to handle his pet timber rattlesnake. It was a creature he knew well, having worked with these snakes for decades. As Marty approached the enclosure, the rattlesnake let out a hiss, perhaps a warning. He didn't take it too seriously, though. He was used to this routine. But before he could react, the snake lunged. The strike was so rapid that it caught him off guard. In an instant, the snake's fangs sank into his left hand, a bite that would prove to be unlike any other he had experienced. William dropped the snake back into its enclosure, his heart pounding. He quickly assessed the damage. 2 small puncture wounds were visible on his hand, with blood trickling out. He knew the feeling too well. The tingling sensation that spread up his arm was a familiar sign. This was no dry bite. The venom was already working its way into his bloodstream, and Marty knew that he needed help immediately. He called out to his wife, Gwen Miller. Although Gwen had seen similar incidents before, this one felt different. It wasn't the typical dry bite she was used to. This seemed much more serious. Without hesitation, she rushed to his side, helping him into the car, and drove straight to the nearest hospital just over 7 miles away. Marty was no stranger to life-threatening situations. He had escaped a Colombian prison, trekked through unforgiving jungles, and faced venomous snakes in remote corners of the world. But this time, what seemed like a simple bite would soon prove to be far more dangerous. As the venom spread, the pain intensified and his body began to weaken. Despite receiving prompt antivenom, the effects were unlike anything he had encountered before. His vision blurred, his chest tightened, and his breathing became labored. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, but the venom showed no mercy. By the time night fell, Marty's condition had taken a sharp turn for the worse. His family gathered around his bedside, Gwen, his daughters, and close friends, all watching in silence as the man who had dedicated his life to studying and respecting these creatures now struggled to survive against one of them. As the hours passed, his body continued to weaken. By morning, William Martin, a pioneer in herpetology, had passed away. Marty's death was a blow to the herpetological community. He had contributed greatly to the study of rattlesnakes, documenting their population numbers and observing the effects of climate change on their habitats. His groundbreaking research had shaped how scientists understood the species, and his name was respected by those in the field. He had been featured in documentaries, including one with Steve Irwin on the Crocodile Hunter series, where he shared his knowledge of timber rattlers with the world. Yet, in the end, it was a single strike from a snake he had handled countless times before that claimed his life. The news of his death rippled through the community. Tributes poured in, recounting his dedication to studying rattlesnakes, his adventurous spirit, and his refusal to let age slow him down. Even those who had never met him felt the loss, as his contributions had shaped their own work. It was a quiet, humid evening in June 2018 on Muna Island, a small, tranquil land nestled off Sulawesi's southern coast. The air, thick with the scent of wet earth from the recent rains, was unusually cool for the time of year, a pleasant 68 degrees Fahrenheit after a sweltering day in the low 90s. The island, just over 650 square miles, was surrounded by turquoise waters and golden sandy beaches. Lush jungles, dense with undergrowth, hid freshwater lagoons and cascading waterfalls. But beneath their beauty, the jungles concealed a lurking danger, one that the island's inhabitants, like Watiba, would soon come to face, unseen and unforgiving. Watiba, a 54-year-old woman, had just finished her daily chores in the vegetable garden she tended to feed her family and sell at the local market. She had been struggling with wild boars that had been raiding her garden at night, destroying her crops. Her hard work was repeatedly ruined. Frustrated, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Tonight, she intended to drive them off for good. The walk to the garden, half a mile from the village, was one she knew well. It passed through thick undergrowth and rocky outcrops. Beyond the trees, the path curved toward a large cliff with caves on its rocky face, a known spot for snakes. Watiba had grown up in these surroundings and was familiar with the risks. As she walked, the night was still except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The jungle, normally full of life, felt oddly quiet tonight. She arrived at her garden and immediately saw the wild boars. They were rooting around, their snouts digging into the freshly planted vegetables. Without hesitation, Watiba shouted and clapped her hands. The boars squealed and bolted into the forest. Relieved, she moved closer to inspect the damage. The flashlight beam flickered across the overturned soil, showing signs of destruction. But as Watiba leaned in to assess the mess, something far more dangerous was closing in. A predator, attracted by the scent of the boars, had caught the trail and was moving swiftly toward her. Watiba didn't realize the danger until it was too late. A massive reticulated python, 23 feet long, suddenly struck. It lunged at Watiba, its fangs sinking into her back. The force of the strike sent her sprawling to the ground, the machete slipping from her grasp and falling with a clatter. Pain exploded across her body as she scrambled to get to her feet, but the python was faster. In one fluid motion, it coiled around her, its immense strength pinning her arms and legs. The pressure was suffocating. The python's body wrapped tighter with every movement she made. Watiba's vision blurred as she gasped for breath, her ribs unable to expand under the snake's constriction. The jungle, once alive with the sound of night, seemed eerily silent as she struggled in vain, her energy draining quickly. The crushing grip of the python left her helpless. She fought with every ounce of strength, but the snake's hold only tightened. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Watiba's body grew limp as the snake continued to constrict. Her heart raced before eventually slowing. The weight of the snake's body, combined with its unrelenting pressure, extinguished her life. In the darkness of the night, Watiba's struggles ceased. By morning, her family noticed she had not returned. They alerted the village and a search party of more than 100 people was formed. They retraced her steps, finding her flashlight and sandals near the garden, but no sign of her. The village grew desperate. Then a cry rang out. A villager had found something. A 23-foot reticulated python was struggling to move, its bloated body suggesting something inside it had been consumed. The search party killed the snake, severing its head before carefully carrying its enormous body back to the village. When the snake was laid out on the ground, a sharp knife was used to cut open its belly. What they found inside shocked them. Watiba's body, still intact and wearing the same clothes she had worn the night before, emerged from the python's gut. The village stood in stunned silence, some gasping in disbelief. The sight was too much to bear. Watiba had become the snake's prey. Her body was carefully laid out, and the villagers, shaken by the discovery, could only look on in horror. The event sent shockwaves through the community, and fear of the surrounding wilderness grew. The island had always been a place of peaceful isolation, but the encroachment of human activity on the natural world was beginning to cause increasingly dangerous encounters between people and wildlife. The balance had shifted, and the shadow of danger was now closer than ever. Watiba's funeral took place that same day, a somber event in which the village came together to mourn the loss of one of their own. Her children, still too young to fully grasp the enormity of what had happened, had to say their final goodbyes. When she left that evening to tend to her garden, no one could have predicted it would be the last time they would ever see her. Audrey McIntosh was savoring the final days of summer before her life changed forever. At 18, she had just graduated high school and was only weeks away from beginning her college journey. The last days before adulthood were slipping through her fingers, and she intended to enjoy every last moment. Her days were spent sleeping in, meeting up with friends, and soaking in the late summer warmth. Most of her high school classmates were moving on, some heading off to universities across the country, others choosing apprenticeships or gap years abroad. The group that had once been inseparable was now scattering to different corners of the world, and Audrey was making the most of the time she had left with them. The summer of 2011 was fun, but had created perfect conditions for snake activity in residential areas. Record-breaking temperatures averaging 5 degrees above normal, combined with unusual rainfall patterns, had driven copperheads from their traditional woodland habitats into suburban spaces. By August, Georgia's Wildlife Resources Division had recorded a 47% increase in snake sightings compared to previous years. Home gutters, with their shade and collected moisture, had become particularly attractive refuges for these heat-sensitive predators. At home during the summer, her responsibilities were few. Her mother had given her only 2 tasks: keep the dishes clean and take care of the laundry. It was a simple routine, one Audrey didn't mind at all. Some afternoons, she even started dinner to make her mother's life a little easier. They lived on the outskirts of town, just a 10-minute drive from the city, in a quiet, picturesque home with no close neighbors, except for Mr. and Mrs. Hentley, an elderly couple who lived half a mile away on a small farm. Audrey adored them, often walking over with fresh strawberries from her family's garden just to sit and chat for an hour or two. Of all the people she'd be leaving when she moved away for college, she knew she would miss the Hentleys the most. It was a quiet, peaceful summer, until the morning when everything changed. On that fateful morning, Audrey woke earlier than usual, stirred from sleep by the sound of her parents' cars leaving the driveway. Unable to drift back to sleep, she decided to get a head start on the day. After a long shower, she loaded the washing machine and spent the next 40 minutes packing her dorm room boxes while she waited for the cycle to finish. By the time the sun had fully risen, the clothes were ready to be hung outside to dry. The McIntosh family never used a dryer during the summer. There was no need when the sun did the job just as well. Dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, Audrey stepped outside with her laundry basket. The morning was already warm and the cheerful chirping of birds filled the air. She glanced up at the house's chimney, where a pair of yellow warblers had perched, singing their morning tune. For a brief moment, she paused, watching them flit and flutter against the clear blue sky. In that same moment, her basket lightly knocked against the house's gutter. It was a soft, barely noticeable bump, something Audrey didn't even register. But something inside the gutter did. Coiled among the dried leaves, a copperhead had been resting, hidden away in the shaded crevice of the metal pipe. The vibration of the impact startled it, making it shift uncomfortably. It remained still at first, reluctant to move, but now it was alert, its body tensed, its tongue flicking as it tasted the air. Copperheads are masters of concealment in human environments. Their distinctive hourglass pattern, which stands out in photographs, becomes nearly invisible against decomposing leaves and metal oxidation. These snakes can remain motionless for up to 72 hours, conserving energy while waiting for prey. Their preferred temperature range of 78 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit matches exactly with the microclimate created by residential gutters. Most importantly, their strike response is triggered by vibration rather than visual stimuli, making accidental encounters particularly dangerous. Unaware of the hidden danger, Audrey turned back toward the clothesline, unintentionally knocking the gutter again. This time, the copperhead didn't hesitate. It struck. Faster than the blink of an eye, the snake lashed out, its fangs sinking deep into Audrey's bare calf, just above her right ankle. She gasped in shock, a sharp, searing pain spreading through her leg like wildfire. For a split second, she didn't even process what had happened. Just that something had hit her, something bad. The copperhead retracted just as quickly as it had struck, disappearing back into its hiding place. But the damage was already done. The venom was injected. Audrey stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. Though she had only caught a glimpse of it, she knew what had bitten her. Every child in the South grew up with the same warning: beware of copperheads. She had seen their pictures in textbooks, she had heard stories of their painful bites, and now she was living it. Panic surged through her. She should have called for help. She should have grabbed her phone and dialed 911. She should have stayed still. But fear had taken hold of her mind, clouding her judgment. And instead of staying put, she did the worst possible thing. She ran. Instinct took over, and Audrey bolted, heading toward the only place she could think of, the Hentleys. The elderly couple's farmhouse was just a half a mile away. It felt like the safest place, the closest place. And in her panic, she believed if she could just get there, she would be okay. But every step she took was making things worse. Audrey's sprint across the field accelerated the venom spread exponentially. Each step increased her heart rate, pushing the toxins deeper into her system. At a running pace, blood circulation increases by 400%. Her heartbeat pounded like a war drum, accelerating the speed of venom through her bloodstream. The hemotoxins were already at work, attacking her red blood cells, destroying the tissue in her leg. She could feel it, spreading, burning, eating through her calf. Halfway through the open field, she was sobbing. 3/4 of the way, her vision started to blur. Her limbs felt like lead. By the time she reached the Henleys' driveway, she barely had the strength to stand. Mr. Hentley, watering his garden, turned just in time to see Audrey stumble toward him. Her face was pale, drenched in sweat. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead collapsed to the ground, vomiting violently. The old man rushed to her side, shouting for his wife. Audrey's body convulsed, her bitten legs stretched out in an unnatural angle. The venom had already begun shutting down her nervous system. Somewhere in the midst of her pain and delirium, she managed to choke out the words, "Copperhead." Mr. Hentley's heart sank. He looked down at her leg and saw the bite marks. The skin around them had already turned black, the necrosis spreading fast. As the ambulance arrived, Audrey's convulsions worsened. Her body was shutting down, her organs failing. The paramedics rushed to stabilize her, but the venom had done its job too well. Within minutes of being loaded into the ambulance, Audrey lost consciousness. She never woke up again. Her death was a cruel twist of fate. Copperhead bites almost never kill. But a combination of dehydration, panic, and an undiagnosed heart condition turned a survivable bite into a lethal one. A week later, Mr. Hentley returned to the McIntosh home. The laundry was still strewn across the yard. The house felt empty. But as he picked up the fallen clothes, his foot tapped against the gutter, and from inside he heard it. A low, angry hiss. The snake had never left. This time he was ready. With one swift movement, he dispatched the copperhead, ending the life of the creature that had taken Audrey's. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. It was a warm, quiet afternoon on May 27, 2019 in Brunswick, Georgia, where 62-year-old Priscilla Meredith spent another peaceful day tending to her garden. Originally from West Virginia, she had made Brunswick her home for over 30 years. Known for her love of nature, Priscilla had always admired the vibrant flowers she grew around her house. Over the years, her garden became her sanctuary, a place to unwind and connect with the earth. That morning, Priscilla and her sister were collecting gardening tools and stepping stones in preparation for the coming summer. As they worked, Priscilla moved toward a spot to sit. She didn't notice the timber rattlesnake lying only a few feet away, hidden among the shrubs. Its brown, banded body blended seamlessly with the surroundings, making it almost invisible. The snake, coiled and poised, lay in wait. Timber rattlesnakes, native to the eastern United States, are considered one of North America's most dangerous snakes. Growing up to 5 feet long, they can strike with remarkable speed. Their venom is potent, and though anti-venom is highly effective in saving lives, untreated bites can lead to severe damage or death. Although rattlesnakes rarely result in fatalities, they account for thousands of bites each year. In fact, 8,000 people report being bitten annually, but only a handful of those are fatal. Timber rattlesnakes, however, are not aggressive by nature and generally avoid humans, only striking when threatened. But when they do strike, the consequences can be far more devastating than anyone might expect, and Priscilla would learn that truth in the most horrific way possible. As Priscilla lowered herself to the ground to rest, she came within inches of the snake. Without warning, the rattlesnake struck with swift precision. Priscilla felt the sharp pain of the fangs sinking into her skin. The snake quickly retreated, its yellowish-brown body still visible through the shrubs. A tingling sensation spread around the bite site as Priscilla jumped back, heart pounding. Her sister acted quickly, pulling her away from the snake and assessing the injury. Though the bite didn't seem to cause immediate swelling or bruising, the damage had been done. There was a chance the bite could have been dry, as rattlesnakes sometimes strike without releasing venom. However, within moments, Priscilla began to feel the effects of venom entering her bloodstream. Nausea set in and her breathing became labored. Her vision blurred and the tingling sensation spread further from the wound. She knew immediate medical attention was crucial. Her husband Timothy rushed her to Southeast Georgia Health Systems Hospital, about 3 miles away. Upon arrival, an ER doctor examined the bite, but instead of administering anti-venom, consulted with Georgia Poison Control, the standard practice in such cases. The doctor sought guidance on how best to proceed. The advice he received, however, would prove disastrous. The poison control team, upon reviewing the situation, recommended withholding anti-venom since there were no visible signs of swelling or bruising around the bite. The doctor, following protocol, agreed. Though Priscilla continued to feel worsening symptoms, they were told to monitor her condition without immediate treatment. As time passed, the venom rapidly spread through her body. Priscilla's condition deteriorated further, her chest tightened and her organs began to fail. Her kidneys functioned at less than 30%, and dialysis became a daily necessity. The venom, now affecting her muscles, caused involuntary twitching known as myoclonus, which became increasingly painful. Despite these symptoms, medical staff focused on treating the effects rather than addressing the venom directly. By the time Priscilla went into cardiac arrest, her body was in critical condition. The medical team rushed into action, managing to stabilize her temporarily. She was placed into a medically induced coma and connected to a ventilator. But the damage had already been done. Her kidneys were failing and her body struggled to process the venom. Days passed, then weeks, with no improvement. Priscilla's family remained by her side, but her condition continued to worsen. Her husband Timothy was horrified at the medical staff's failure to administer the life-saving antivenom that could have prevented such suffering. It was clear to him that had the venom been treated properly, Priscilla could have survived. After several weeks of futile treatment, Priscilla passed away. The delay in receiving antivenom had ultimately been the cause of her death. The decision not to administer the medication, despite the unmistakable symptoms of envenomation, had been catastrophic. In the wake of the tragedy, Timothy filed a lawsuit against Southeast Georgia Health System's Brunswick campus, Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, and Emory University, seeking accountability for the medical negligence that led to his wife's death. He named several doctors involved in the case, hoping to find justice for Priscilla's unnecessary suffering and death. The hospital, along with Georgia Poison Control, defended their actions, stating they had followed established protocols. Dr. Mohsen Aklahi, the medical director at Southeast Georgia Health Systems, explained that the poison control team advised against administering antivenom, citing the absence of swelling or bruising as an indication that it might not be necessary. Dr. Gaylord L., managing director at Georgia Poison Control, reiterated that antivenom is only given in about 25% of cases, often withheld until signs of envenomation are clearly present. It was a warm, clear evening on September 9, 2023, at Kumala State School, a place filled with the sounds of laughter and familiar chatter of long-lost friends reconnecting. The occasion was special, the 100th anniversary of the school, and former students, now scattered far and wide, had gathered to celebrate the memories of their shared past. Donald Morrison, at 68, was among them, surrounded by the faces of those who had once shared the same classrooms and schoolyard. It had been 60 years since the days they roamed these grounds, but for a moment it felt like yesterday. The school, located just 37 miles south of Mackay on Queensland's north coast, lay nestled between sprawling brushland and vast cane farms. The rural town of Kumala had seen little change in the years since Donald had left, though he had never strayed far. It was his home, a place of comfort and nostalgia, where the air was thick with memories as well as the scent of sugarcane and salt from the nearby coast. This evening had been long anticipated, and the reunion felt like a gift. For Donald, it was more than just a chance to revisit the past. It was a celebration of the people and the place that had shaped him. As the evening wore on, Donald and his longtime friend Lloyd Younger stood together in conversation, catching up on life and their respective journeys. The air was cool, and the setting sun cast long shadows over the lawn where the crowd had gathered. But as the last rays of sunlight faded, an unexpected danger stirred in the undergrowth. Lloyd, the friend of Donald, suddenly felt a sharp sensation on his ankle. At first, he thought it was an insect or a brush from a branch, but when the pressure intensified, he looked down. There, coiled around his leg, was a snake. Its scales shimmered with a beautiful brown-gray hue outlined in dark brown lines. The round, jet-black eyes of the eastern brown snake glinted as it gripped tightly onto his ankle. Donald's heart was shocked as he recognized the creature. The eastern brown snake, one of the deadliest in Australia, was notorious for its speed and venom. Donald wasted no time. He slowly bent down toward the snake, his movements deliberate and calculated. Lloyd was starting to panic, fully aware of the deadly potential of an eastern brown snake. but Donald's calm presence kept him from losing control. Positioning himself carefully, Donald brought his hands around toward the back of the snake, his body low to the ground. His fingers hovered just inches from the coiled reptile, each motion precise and cautious. The dim light of the evening cast long shadows, making it harder to judge the snake's position. With a moment of determination, Donald made his move, but the fading light played tricks on his perception and the snake spotted his hand before he could act. In an instant, it struck with incredible speed, its head whipping around to sink its fangs into Donald's arm, leaving no time for him to react. The pain was immediate, sharp, and intense. A cry escaped Donald's lips, but despite the searing pain, he didn't let go of the snake. He gripped the long, muscular body, holding it at arm's length. The creature thrashed violently, striking at him again and again, its powerful jaw snapping dangerously close. Donald's body swerved as he avoided each strike, but the snake's accuracy was relentless. Then, just as Donald thought he had managed to distance himself from the threat, the snake caught him once more, this time on his chest. With a final desperate effort, Donald hurled the snake into the undergrowth, away from the crowd. He paused, breathless, surveying the celebration continuing in the distance. The sound of voices and laughter filled the air, unaware of the danger that had just unfolded on the outskirts of the gathering. As he turned to rejoin the crowd, a strange weakness overtook him. His vision blurred and his legs gave way. He staggered toward Lloyd before collapsing in a heap at his feet. Panic rippled through those nearby as they rushed to his side, desperate to help him. But Donald's chest was already heavy with the weight of the venom spreading through his veins. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, his body succumbing to the poison coursing through him. Despite the efforts of those around him, CPR, defibrillators, emergency services, the venom worked faster than any intervention. The paramedics worked tirelessly for 30 minutes, but the poison was too strong. Donald's heart gave out. He was gone before the helicopter could even arrive. Lloyd, still shaken and now fearing the worst, was quickly airlifted to McKay Base Hospital. He had received the same bite, but unlike Donald, he had been lucky. The snake, acting more defensively than aggressively, had delivered a dry bite, a rare but not unheard of occurrence. While the snake had left its marks, it had not injected venom into Lloyd, and he was soon treated and released the following day. The anniversary celebration, once filled with joy and laughter, had turned into a scene of chaos and sorrow. The news of Donald's sudden, tragic death spread quickly. He was remembered by all who knew him as the boy who had always had a joke ready, the cheeky one who brought joy to those around him. And now that same infectious spirit was gone, taken by a fate that seemed impossible for such a man to meet. But as the community mourned, a strange truth began to unfold. Donald's body, despite the visible bite marks from the snake, contained no venom. It was a baffling discovery. Eastern brown snakes were notorious for their venomous strikes, but the snake had not injected venom into Donald's body. It was a dry bite, a warning from the snake rather than an attack meant to capture prey. The coroner's report, though incomplete, hinted at something else. It seemed Donald had suffered a cardiac arrest, likely triggered by the fear and stress of the encounter, compounded by an underlying health condition. His heart, already fragile, gave out under the strain of the situation. In the end, Donald Morrison's death was not due to the venom of the eastern brown snake, but rather the sudden shock of the encounter. While he had been a victim of the snake's warning, it was his heart that failed him. The community of Kumala lost a beloved man, a friend, a jokester, a part of the fabric that held the town together. It was July 20th, 2022 when 29-year-old Elliot Sensman from Pennsylvania began his day as usual, tending to his beloved snakes. Known for his deep passion for reptiles, Elliot spent his days rescuing and rehabilitating snakes that others had abandoned. He had a special bond with these animals, and his expertise was unmatched. He handled everything from small garter snakes to the massive boa constrictors and pythons that others feared. But on this particular morning, as he entered the room to care for his snakes, he had no inkling that his life was about to end in the most tragic way. Elliot's love for snakes began at the age of 10. Over the years, he had developed an extensive knowledge of their care, understanding their needs and behaviors. He had spent the last 6 years focusing on rescuing snakes that had been abused or neglected, giving them a chance to heal and find new homes. His collection included several large snakes, but there was one in particular that required extra caution, an 18-foot boa constrictor which had a history of aggression. It had been rescued from a home where it had been poorly treated, leaving it distrustful of humans. Despite its size and temperament, Elliot had always approached the snake with the utmost care. He knew the risks but was undeterred by the challenge. That morning, like many others, Elliot began his routine by checking on the snakes. His first task was feeding and cleaning the enclosures, ensuring each snake was comfortable and properly cared for. As he moved from cage to cage, everything seemed normal until he reached the boa constrictor's enclosure. He paused. The snake's behavior had been erratic over the past few days, more restless, more unpredictable. It slithered in tight, erratic loops, pressing against the glass as though it couldn't find a place to settle. A slight unease crept over Elliot, but he dismissed it. The boa was still adjusting to its new life after years of abuse. He had seen this kind of restlessness before, especially in snakes with such a troubled past. But today, the snake's behavior was different. Its movements were more intense than usual. Elliot opened the cage slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the snake. It hissed, its tongue flicking the air, but that was typical. His hands were steady as he reached inside, familiar with the snake's temperament. Yet its movements were sharper, more agitated. Elliot remained cautious, aware that even well-known reptiles could become unpredictable when stressed. And then the snake struck. It lunged from the shadows, its powerful coils wrapping around Elliot's body with swift precision. Elliot's hands fumbled as he tried to respond, but the snake's grip tightened quickly. The boa constrictor's massive coils pressed against his chest, constricting with increasing pressure, squeezing the air from his lungs. Elliot's grandmother, who had been in the other room, heard the commotion and rushed to help. What she found was a horrifying sight. Her grandson, once full of life and energy, was now lying on the floor, his face turning pale as the snake tightened its grip around his neck. She screamed for help, but in the chaos it seemed there was no time. Elliot, always so cautious, had misjudged the situation. It was unclear whether it was already too late. With shaky hands, she dialed 911. When the Upper Macungie Township Police arrived, they found Elliot unconscious, showing symptoms of a heart attack. The snake's grip was still strong, its coils twisted around his neck, constricting further as it sensed its prey was weakening. The officers were paralyzed with indecision. The snake was massive, easily over 15 feet in length, and they couldn't risk shooting it in the head. A miss could injure Elliot. After a tense few moments, the officers took action, firing at the snake's body. The rounds weren't enough to kill the animal, but they were enough to make it loosen its grip, allowing the officers to pull it off Elliot. As soon as the snake was removed, paramedics rushed to Elliot's side. He was quickly transported to Lehigh Valley Hospital, Cedar Crest. But despite their best efforts, Elliot never regained consciousness. For 4 days, he remained in critical care, fighting for his life, but his body had already been deprived of oxygen for too long. On July 24th, Elliot Sensman passed away. The cause of death was later confirmed as anoxic brain injury caused by the constriction. The news of Elliot's death sent shockwaves through the community. Friends, family, and colleagues were left in disbelief. Elliot had dedicated his life to rescuing snakes, understanding their nature better than anyone else. He had always been the person people turned to when a snake was in trouble, and now one of the very creatures he loved so much had taken his life. His mother, Heather, couldn't understand how something so tragic could happen to someone so careful, so dedicated. "My son was unique and kind," she said in an interview. "He should still be with us today." In the months that followed, the tragic incident became a topic of discussion, with many calling for more regulation of exotic pets, particularly snakes. While Elliot's love for reptiles was undeniable, his death highlighted the potential consequences of caring for such creatures, especially when their behavior is unpredictable due to past trauma. The legacy of his work, however, would live on in the countless snakes he had helped, and the awareness he had raised about the importance of proper care and rehabilitation for animals in need. It was a quiet evening in Hampshire, England, where Brandon had spent countless hours immersed in his passion for reptiles. His bedroom, tucked away in a corner of the house, was a sanctuary, a space where snakes and tarantulas lived in harmony, all under his expert care. He was a herpetologist, not just a casual enthusiast, and his collection of 10 snakes and 12 tarantulas was more than just a hobby, it was his life's work. From a young age, Brandon had been captivated by the fascinating world of reptiles. At 10, he was hooked on nature documentaries, mesmerized by the slithering movements of snakes and the silent predatory grace of tarantulas. By 15, he was holding his first snake in his hands, and from that point, his collection and knowledge only grew. Among all of Brandon's animals, one stood out above the rest. Tiny, a 7.9-foot-long African rock python. She was an impressive creature, destined to grow even larger, with the potential to reach lengths of 13 feet or more. Tiny had been with him for years, and what began as a small, manageable pet had transformed into a massive, muscle-bound serpent, coiling with strength and power. Tiny was usually kept in a secure enclosure, a large reinforced glass tank designed to house her safely. However, Brandon often allowed her out to roam freely during feeding times or when he spent time handling her. Despite her size and strength, he treated Tiny like family, caring for her with the same devotion as he did for his other reptiles. In his eyes, Tiny was more than a pet, she was a companion, an integral part of his world. But as Tiny grew, so did the risks. A python's constriction isn't an act of aggression, it's a calculated move for survival, an instinct honed over millennia. Pythons only squeeze when they're preparing to strike, when they're ready to feed. But with Tiny's increasing size and strength, Brandon knew that handling her required more caution. No longer could he drape her casually around his shoulders or let her explore freely as he had when she was smaller. The risks of handling an 8-foot python were simply too great. Yet Brandon's love for the snake often clouded his judgment. On the day everything went wrong, he allowed Tiny to roam freely in his room, underestimating the danger in doing so. August 25, 2017 began like any other day. Brandon, a landscaper by trade, returned home after work eager to relax. He lived with his parents who were downstairs at the time. Brandon's usual routine was to head upstairs to change before returning downstairs to spend time with his reptiles. But this evening, something was different. Just after heading up to his bedroom, a sudden ominous thud echoed through the house. There was no cry of pain, no shout for help, just silence. Brandon's father, hearing the noise from the living room, grew concerned and went to investigate. When he opened the door to Brandon's room, the sight that greeted him was nothing short of horrifying. There, on the floor, was Brandon motionless, his body sprawled out on the floor in a way that was entirely unnatural. Tiny was nowhere to be found. Panic gripped his heart as he called for Brandon's mother to dial emergency services. They rushed upstairs, but their attempts to revive Brandon were futile. He remained unresponsive. 8 long minutes passed before the paramedics arrived, but it was too late. The 31-year-old man, once so full of life and enthusiasm for his reptiles, was dead. Tiny, for her part, had slithered off into a corner of the room, seemingly content, her behavior eerily calm in contrast to the chaos unfolding around her. The investigation into Brandon's death was swift, but the cause of his demise was unclear. The coroner's report indicated asphyxiation, but there were no marks on his body to suggest a violent struggle. There were no bruises or bite marks, nothing to indicate that Tiny had attacked him in the way many would expect from a predatory animal. Snake expert Professor Scott Boback offered a different perspective. According to him, constriction alone wasn't the most likely cause of death in this case. Instead, he suggested that Tiny's grip might have caused a sudden restriction of blood flow to Brandon's brain, triggering a cardiac arrest. The massive pressure from the python's coiling could have caused Brandon to lose consciousness in mere seconds, and without immediate intervention, his heart would have stopped, leading to his tragic death. Further examination of the scene revealed something curious. Despite the absence of bite marks or signs of a struggle, the experts couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong, something beyond just a simple accident. Veterinarian John Cooper, who had joined the investigation, took a closer look at Tiny's recently shed skin. There were no signs that Brandon had fought for his life, no frantic claw marks or scratches. Tiny's skin was intact, and there were no indications of struggle. This was an unsettling discovery, raising more questions than answers. Despite all the evidence pointing toward an accidental death, there remained a lingering suspicion that Tiny had somehow been responsible. Could it be that the python had been acting out of affection for her owner? Snakes, after all, aren't known for the same kind of attachment that a dog or a cat might display. Their interactions with humans are often driven by instinct, whether it's for warmth, security, or simply the comfort of being close to their handler. In Tiny's case, it was possible that the snake had wrapped herself around Brandon not out of aggression, but because she had felt a need for closeness. The gripping power of the python, combined with Brandon's inability to escape, might have turned into something deadly, even if it was never the snake's intention. Adding to the mystery was the discovery of a faint rib fracture on Brandon's body, likely caused by the python's powerful coils. This too suggested that Tiny's grip had been too much, that the strength of her coils had overwhelmed Brandon's body in a way that he couldn't escape. Months after the tragedy, Brandon's parents faced a difficult decision. Despite their grief, they couldn't bring themselves to put down the python. Tiny had been an integral part of their son's life, and they didn't see her as a vicious animal. However, her growing size and the weight of the tragedy led them to rehome her. Tiny was sent to the National Center for Reptile Welfare at Hadlow College in Tunbridge, Kent. The full truth of what happened in that bedroom remains shrouded in mystery, known only to Tiny. It was early in the morning on October 21, 2022, when Jara, a 54-year-old grandmother, left her home in the village of Batara on the island of Sumatra. The sky was still dark, with only the moon casting a pale glow through the dense jungle. Jara had worked in the rubber plantations for decades. For her, the long, grueling hours under the scorching midday sun had become a way of life. The plantation was vast, its rows of rubber trees stretching as far as the eye could see. Jara's job as a trapper required her to cut diagonal slashes into the thick bark of the trees, collecting the rubber that dripped out into waiting containers. It was hard, physical work, but it paid the bills. Jara's family, like many others in the region, depended on her income. Though she worked tirelessly every day, her earnings were modest. With an additional side job and a relentless schedule of working 7 days a week, she managed to bring in just $55. Even after years of labor, Jara's position at the plantation was precarious, as she was considered a day laborer with no formal contractor benefits. There was no job security, no promise of better pay or retirement, yet she pressed on as many others in her village did, because the needs of her family left little room for anything else. The rubber plantation was nestled in Jambi province, a place of incredible natural beauty. Surrounded by the Barisan Mountains and volcanic peaks, the area was rich with lush green valleys and meandering rivers. However, this breathtaking landscape had been slowly changing over the years. Since the year 2000, Indonesia had lost 18% of its tree cover, much of it to deforestation for agriculture. Plantations such as Jara's had been established to cultivate crops like rice, tobacco, palm oil, and rubber, further encroaching on the wildlife-rich environment that had once flourished here. By the time Jara arrived at the plantation that morning, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft light over the landscape. She signed in and got to work. With a practiced hand, she carefully made the slashes into the rubber trees, the knife sharp and steady. She moved quickly, anticipating the steady drip of rubber, which she would collect into small plastic cups or coconut shells. The hours passed as she continued her work, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She had no idea she wasn't alone in the dense undergrowth. Unseen, a large python was silently closing in, its movements hidden in the shadows. The first sign of danger came when a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her back, making her stumble forward as her knife clattered to the ground. Before she could react, something massive coiled tightly around her body. Jara was shocked as she realized the enormity of the creature now wrapping itself around her. The python's thick, muscular coils constricted tighter and tighter, pulling her down to the ground. Panic surged through her body, but there was little she could do to free herself. The snake's grip was relentless. Her arms were pinned to her sides, and no matter how much she squirmed or struggled, the python only squeezed harder, its grip like a vice. Jara's sandals slipped off her feet as she kicked and writhed, her headscarf falling from her head and settling silently into the dirt. Her chest heaved in desperate attempts to breathe, but the pressure was suffocating. She could feel the life draining from her with each agonizing second as the snake's coils continued to tighten around her. Her lungs burned and the world began to fade. She knew there was no escaping. Within minutes, Jara was dead, alone in the rubber plantation, the victim of an attack she could not have anticipated. When the snake was sure its prey was no longer struggling, it loosened its grip, uncoiling from Jara's lifeless body. The python moved slowly, its unblinking eyes fixed on her. Its jaws began to stretch wider, far wider than a human's head, as the snake prepared to consume its meal. The process was slow and methodical as the snake's mouth enveloped Jara's body. The giant predator worked its way over her shoulders, her head, and down her torso. By the end of the day, the massive snake had consumed Jara entirely. Her body swallowed whole, leaving no trace behind but the empty space where she had once stood. As evening fell and Jara failed to return home, her husband grew worried. He knew the path she took each day through the jungle to the plantation, and he set off to find her, calling her name as he walked through the rows of rubber trees. He came upon her belongings, her jacket, sandals, and knife, lying abandoned on the ground. There was no sign of her, no sound of her voice. Panic settled in, and he raced back to the village to gather help. A group of villagers joined him, and together they searched through the plantation well into the night. But as darkness deepened, they were forced to return home, defeated, unsure of where to turn next. Jara's husband reported her missing to the local police, and the search continued the next day. He led the officers to the spot where he had found her belongings, and the search resumed in earnest. But it wasn't until 2 days later that a local villager stumbled upon a shocking discovery: a giant reticulated python nearly 20 feet long, lying motionless in the grass. The snake's body was grotesquely bloated, clearly engorged with something large. The villagers reacted in horror as they realized the enormity of what had transpired. Under orders from the police chief, the python's body was carefully cut open. As the snake's body split open from head to tail, the onlookers recoiled in shock. Jara's body, completely intact, spilled out onto the ground. It was a gruesome and terrifying revelation, one that would haunt her family for the rest of their lives. In the wake of Jara's death, villagers recalled reports of an even larger snake, a python estimated to be 27 feet long, spotted in the area recently. Attempts had been made to capture it, but the snake had managed to evade capture, slithering back into the surrounding forest. The discovery of such a massive snake living near their homes filled the villagers with fear, knowing that their lives were being increasingly intruded upon by these creatures. It was the autumn of 2019 in Oxford, Indiana, a small town where neighbors knew each other by name and houses lined the quiet streets. Among these houses on the North Dan Patch Drive stood a house that most avoided, though there was little to suggest it was anything but ordinary. The modest bungalow, painted a faded blue, held a secret. Inside, it was alive, not with people but with reptiles. Over 140 snakes, large and small, filled rows of tanks, their sleek bodies moving in hypnotic patterns. For Benton County Sheriff Don Munson, this house was more than a hobby, it was a haven for his beloved collection. Among the residents was Simba, a 13-foot reticulated python and the crown jewel of Don's collection. While Don cared for these creatures with a careful hand, he'd learned to treat each one with respect. Handling these animals required both skill and caution. Even the gentlest of pythons could become unpredictable. Friends occasionally questioned the risks he took, reminding him of the power coiled beneath each snake's scales. But to Don, the thrill was worth it, and he carried on, trusting his experience and routine to keep him safe. But Don wasn't the only one enchanted by these creatures. His friend Laura Hurst shared his love for snakes. As a 36-year-old mother and fellow reptile enthusiast, Laura had been fascinated by wildlife since her childhood on a cattle farm. There, she often caught small garter snakes and marveled at their tiny, twisting forms. Over the years, her fascination had grown, and she eventually began to keep larger and more exotic species. Don's arrangement allowed her to house her own collection safely, and she visited twice a week to care for them, a routine she would soon wish she'd never started. Laura loved her time at the house, finding peace in the soft hum of the tank lights and the quiet rustling as snakes moved inside their enclosures. She had become familiar with each one's unique personality, knowing which needed gentle handling and which responded best when left undisturbed. These animals had become her companions, a world she alone could understand. Yet, even with her expertise, her confidence masked a danger she rarely considered. That Wednesday evening on October 30th, Laura arrived at the house as usual, parking her car in the driveway and stepping into the darkened interior. The lights in each tank cast an eerie glow in the dim rooms, shadows sliding over glass as she moved from tank to tank, checking on each of her snakes. Tonight, her focus was on her favorite, a sleek, muscular, 8-foot reticulated python she had raised from a juvenile. This snake had been calm for years, often allowing her to handle it without issue. But as she reached for it, a slight unease washed over her, something she couldn't quite explain. The snake was heavier than usual, and as she lifted it from the tank, its thick body draped over her shoulders like a live, warm scarf. Reticulated pythons are native to Southeast Asia and are among the longest snakes in the world, growing up to 20 feet and weighing as much as 165 pounds or 75 kilograms. Known for their strength, they kill by constriction rather than venom, wrapping around their prey and tightening until the animal suffocates. Despite the inherent danger in their predatory nature, they are kept as pets due to their relatively manageable care in captivity. Laura had handled them before, but tonight the snake's behavior was unusual. At first, the weight was familiar and reassuring, but gradually the python's grip tightened around her neck, its muscles pressed harder against her. The change was subtle, almost easy to miss. But as Laura shifted, trying to adjust the snake, its coils grew tighter, wrapping further around her neck and shoulders. She gently tried to loosen the grip, but the snake resisted. Its body was unyielding, a heavy loop that refused to let go. Laura struggled for air, her chest tight as the snake's coils tightened further. her lips began to turn a deep shade of blue and her eyes started to bulge as her breathing became increasingly labored. She couldn't scream for help, nor could she reach her phone. Everything was happening too fast. The pressure on her throat was suffocating and the lack of oxygen caused her head to spin. As her vision blurred, a sense of helplessness washed over her. Within seconds, she slumped to the ground, her body going limp. The snake, unrelenting, continued to constrict around her, even though she was now motionless and unresponsive. Hours later, across the yard, Don noticed Laura's car still parked in the driveway as he looked out his window that evening. She usually finished her routine checks by now, so he decided to check in on her. Entering the house, he called her name. No response. He walked past the open tanks, his steps echoing through the silent rooms, until he entered the last room and found a scene that would haunt him forever. Laura was lying motionless on the floor, the snake's coils still draped loosely around her, its deadly grip now loosened, but too late. Don rushed forward, pulling the python away, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. He dialed emergency services, but his voice trembled as he spoke. It was already too late. Laura had been his friend, his confidant in the world of reptiles. Her death sent a shockwave through him, one he couldn't have predicted despite his years of handling snakes. Her passing was swift, merciless, and left him standing in a house that had once been filled with life, now quiet and empty, a cruel reminder of what had just occurred. In the aftermath of Laura's death, the community was shaken. Questions surfaced about Don's snake breeding operation. Had he followed the proper legal procedures? In Indiana, reticulated pythons were not regulated because they were not a native species, but there were no permits required, as long as the snakes were not venomous or endangered. Since 1978, 18 people in the U.S. have died from snake constriction, yet incidents like Laura's were incredibly rare, often overshadowed by other dangers. Reptile enthusiasts pointed out that dogs caused far more injuries and deaths each year. Despite this, Laura's tragic fate brought national attention, and the town council quickly moved to introduce new regulations to ensure people were aware of who kept dangerous animals and where they were housed. In March 2023, Beaver County, Pennsylvania would witness an incident so bizarre, so unexpected, that it would be talked about for decades. It was a case so unsettling that it became a cautionary tale for rookie officers, a lesson that any seemingly routine day could spiral into chaos in an instant. By 2023, America's exotic reptile trade had become a multi-million-dollar industry operating in legal gray areas. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated over 500,000 venomous snakes were kept in private collections nationwide, with only 30% properly permitted. Pennsylvania alone had recorded 127 incidents involving illegal reptiles in the previous year, though experts believe this represented less than 10% of actual cases. The average black mamba could fetch $15,000 on the black market, while rare color morphs of venomous species could sell for upwards of $50,000. When 911 dispatch received a call about an unresponsive man inside a quiet suburban home, they assumed the worst: a heart attack, an overdose, perhaps even a crime of passion. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where children played on their front lawns and neighbors greeted each other on their morning walks. There was no reason to believe anything out of the ordinary had taken place inside the house. But when first responders stepped through the front door, they walked straight into a scene that no amount of training could have prepared them for. The house belonged to 23-year-old Joshua Riggs, who lived there with his longtime girlfriend Jenny and her 3-year-old daughter Maya. Their home wasn't large, just a modest 3-bedroom space that was at the time being shared with Joshua's cousin Morris and his wife Diane. Morris and Diane had moved in only 3 months earlier, arriving from Missouri for one very specific reason: business. But it wasn't drugs, stolen goods, or illegal weapons they were dealing in. Their trade was alive. Joshua and Morris were well known within the reptile community. They weren't just hobbyists, they were specialists. licensed dealers of exotic reptiles, they imported and sold snakes, lizards, and even the occasional crocodile to private collectors and reptile enthusiasts. Their reputations were solid, they were respected, and for the most part their business was entirely legal. Well, sort of. Professional reptile facilities operate under strict guidelines. Temperature must be maintained between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity levels of 60 to 80%, requiring sophisticated climate control systems costing upwards of $30,000. Safety protocols mandate double-locked enclosures, backup power systems, and bite protocols posted every 10 feet. Most importantly, venomous snake rooms must have sealed doors, emergency anti-venom storage, and pressure-monitored ventilation, none of which are possible in typical residential construction. While they had the necessary licensing to import and sell exotic animals, keeping them inside a residential home was another matter entirely. Back in Missouri, they had used a dedicated warehouse for housing their inventory, but the recent move had drained their finances. So, for the time being, they made do with what they had. And what they had was a 3-bedroom house filled with nearly 200 snakes and reptiles. If that wasn't shocking enough, about 70% of them were venomous. Cobras, rattlesnakes, mambas, even a crocodile, all living inside the same home as a toddler. To Joshua and Morris, this wasn't insanity, it was just temporary. They planned to move the animals into a proper facility once they regained their financial footing. But as police officers stepped into the house on that fateful March day, none of that mattered, because lying on the living room floor was Joshua Riggs, and he was very, very dead. The air inside the house was thick and humid, made worse by the heat lamps and temperature regulators keeping the reptiles comfortable. Every wall, every corner, every available space was occupied by something: snakes, lizards, tanks filled with creatures that stared unblinking at the unexpected intruders. One of the paramedics, already unnerved by the sheer number of venomous animals in the room, made the mistake of looking toward the kitchen. There, strapped into her high chair, was little Maya, calmly eating her breakfast, completely unfazed by the presence of first responders. Sitting inches away from her, curled inside its locked glass enclosure, was a boomslang, one of the deadliest snakes in the world. The African boomslang represents one of herpetology's most lethal mysteries. Their venom, a potent hemotoxin, causes death by internal hemorrhaging, with mortality rates reaching 100% if antivenom isn't administered within 8 hours. Unlike cobras or vipers, boomslangs can open their jaws 170 degrees when striking, and their rear-fanged delivery system makes them especially dangerous. The snake that sat near Maya's high chair could deliver enough venom to kill 12 adults, a fact that would later horrify investigating officers. The sight of the child next to the bright green, highly venomous serpent was too much for one of the paramedics. He turned and promptly vomited onto the carpet. Meanwhile, the other medic moved toward Joshua's body. He was motionless, his skin pale, his wrist bearing 2 small puncture wounds. The conclusion seemed obvious. He had been bitten. But something wasn't right. The wound was at least a week old, and Joshua's body wasn't showing signs of venom-induced death. As the house was secured and a medical examiner arrived, it was confirmed Joshua Riggs hadn't died from a snakebite. The cause of death was natural, a freak medical condition that, for reasons never fully disclosed, had claimed his life. But in some ways, that only made the situation more complicated, because now authorities had a far bigger problem on their hands. With Joshua gone, the police were left with a critical question: what do we do with all these animals? By Pennsylvania law, owning venomous reptiles was legal, but keeping them inside a residential home was not. However, Joshua and Morris had taken extreme precautions to ensure safety. Every single cage was equipped with a key lock mechanism. Every venomous creature was housed in a reinforced enclosure. The entire home had security cameras monitoring the animals 24/7 in case of accidental escapes. Had this been a reptile farm or a professional facility, they would have passed an inspection easily. Even Child Protective Services struggled to find legal grounds to intervene. Technically, Maya wasn't in danger. There were no recorded escapes, no safety violations regarding her care. She was healthy, well-fed, and deeply loved by her family. The only real legal issue was the location of the animals. A judge reviewed the case and made a final ruling. Over 100 non-venomous reptiles were allowed to remain in the home, including a 5-foot python. Another 100 venomous creatures were confiscated, including 2 black mambas, one of the most feared and aggressive snakes on the planet, multiple cobras and rattlesnakes, a dwarf crocodile. All confiscated animals were relocated to licensed reptile rescue centers and zoos across the country. Morris and Jenny, both stakeholders in the business, were fined $1,000 per animal removed, resulting in a staggering $100,000 fine. It was a harsh ruling, but considering the sheer number of creatures they had inside their home and the fact that a 3-year-old child lived among them, the judge had no leniency to spare. To make matters worse, the state had to launch a full-scale neighborhood sweep, deploying dozens of wildlife officers to search for any escaped serpents. For days, teams scoured backyards, storm drains, and wooded areas, ensuring no venomous creatures had slithered into unsuspecting residents' homes. They never found a single escapee, because despite how horrifying the setup seemed to outsiders, Joshua and Morris had actually run a tight, disciplined operation. Had Joshua not died, the animals would have soon been moved to their proper facility, and this entire nightmare would have never happened. But fate had other plans, and so the reptile empire they had spent years building was dismantled in an instant. Despite the official ruling of natural causes, there are those who still wonder. Joshua's puncture wound, the venomous creatures he handled daily, the sheer coincidence of his sudden, unexplained death. It all seemed too strange. Some whispered theories that he had been bitten, but that the authorities wanted to avoid a public panic. Others believed it was something else entirely, an allergic reaction, an undiagnosed condition, or something far more sinister. But the truth is, no one will ever know what really happened in that house. Only that on a quiet street in Beaver County, a man died among hundreds of fanged, slithering creatures, leaving behind a family that loved him, a business that crumbled overnight, and a legacy that would forever be remembered in the annals of snake terrors. It was a long holiday weekend in May, and Oliver Baker and his family were looking forward to a relaxing few days at their holiday home on Alabama's Lewis Smith Lake. It had been a year of hard work, and the chance to unwind surrounded by the peaceful wilderness of Walker County was just what they needed. The lake, known for its clear waters and rich wildlife, was the perfect setting for their getaway. It was also a special trip because the family had recently adopted a puppy, a lively Labrador who was bound to make the weekend even more memorable. But beneath the calm, a hidden threat waited, ready to disrupt their idyllic escape. Oliver, at 52 years old, worked in water quality control for the city of Northport. A local through and through, he had grown up in Birmingham, just a short drive from the lake, and was well known and well liked by everyone in town. His generous nature and willingness to lend a hand made him a pillar of the community. He had 2 young sons who looked up to him with admiration, and his loving wife Terry supported him in everything he did. This weekend was meant to be a break from their usual routine, a time to relax, play, and enjoy each other's company. The holiday home itself was perched on a stone patio overlooking the shimmering lake, surrounded by dense woodland. Deer, raccoons, and even the occasional fox roamed the area, though the surrounding forest was also home to copperhead snakes, common residents of the Alabama woodlands. These snakes were not typically aggressive, but they were venomous, and their camouflage against the forest floor made them difficult to spot. Oliver stepped out onto the back patio, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. He marveled at how peaceful the day was. The sun was warm, the air cool and crisp, and the gentle sounds of birds chirping filled the space around him. The puppy, full of energy, raced around the yard, eager to explore everything the new environment had to offer. Oliver, enjoying the moment of calm, decided to take the puppy for a walk down to the lakeshore, a familiar routine they had done many times before. The winding path along the water was the perfect place to stretch his legs and take in the beauty of the lake. As he stepped onto the stone patio, Oliver didn't notice the copperhead coiled just beneath his feet. Blending seamlessly with the stone, it lay basking in the warmth of the sun, its body stretched out in the stillness. Barely noticeable, it was just another part of the natural landscape. The puppy, oblivious to the danger, dashed toward the water, excitement driving her every move. Oliver smiled, following her with a sense of ease, ready for their usual stroll along the lakeshore. But as his foot left the safety of the patio, a sharp sting shot through his left leg. At first, he thought it was a brush against a thorn or sharp object, but when he looked down, his heart dropped. The copperhead, its tongue flicking in and out, had struck. Pain exploded in his leg, burning through him like a bolt of lightning. He staggered back, momentarily unsteady as he registered what had happened. His pulse quickened, sweat forming on his forehead. The venom spread rapidly, tightening his chest and shortening his breath. The attack was underway, leaving no time to process or react. Without thinking, Oliver staggered back to their lake house, pain flaring with every step. His family, startled by the sudden distress, was quick to react. His sons rushed to his side while Terry, fighting panic, called for help. One of the boys sprinted outside and saw the snake still coiled in the corner of the patio, flicking its tongue and watching the family with unwavering eyes. It hadn't moved. His heart pounding, the boy quickly returned to the house, knowing his father's life was slipping away with every passing second. Within moments, Oliver's condition worsened. The venom had begun to spread quickly and he struggled to breathe. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, and collapsed to the floor. The family, helpless in the face of the unfolding tragedy, did everything they could, starting CPR on him as they waited for the paramedics to arrive. While a copperhead bite is rarely fatal, it causes excruciating pain, swelling, and nausea. In most cases, people recover with medical attention, but Oliver's reaction was different. The venom sent his body into shock and his organs began to shut down. Despite the paramedics' swift response, Oliver slipped into anaphylactic shock, a rare but often fatal reaction. The family watched in helpless despair as Oliver was rushed to a nearby school playing field where a helicopter was meant to airlift him to the University of Alabama at Birmingham Hospital. But Oliver's condition was so critical that he was deemed unfit to fly. Instead, he was transported by ambulance to Jasper Hospital. His family, gathered in the waiting room, clung to hope. But as Oliver's body continued to deteriorate, the doctors could do nothing to save him. On Memorial Day, just 3 days after the snake bite, Oliver died in the hospital. The news of his death devastated his family and community. What had started as a joyful weekend getaway ended in heartbreak. His family struggled to comprehend how an ordinary afternoon walk by the lake had led to such an unimaginable loss. It was early morning, September 11, 2001. While the United States was still sleeping, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold, Joseph Slewinski and his team were already deep in the jungles of Myanmar, a world away. It was a land of vast biodiversity and uncharted wilderness. For Joseph, this remote corner of Southeast Asia held the promise of discovery, the chance to add new species to the world's scientific catalog. At 38 years old, Joseph Slewinski was an accomplished herpetologist, a scientist who studied reptiles and amphibians, especially snakes. His passion for these cold-blooded creatures began in his childhood, when, rather than playing with kittens or puppies, young Joseph was fascinated by the slithering creatures that others feared. By the time he reached adulthood, Joseph had earned a reputation for being one of the foremost experts on venomous snakes. His dedication to field work took him across the globe: Mexico, Peru, Costa Rica, and the Bahamas. But Myanmar held a special place in his heart. It was a biodiversity hotspot, home to species found nowhere else. It was here that Joseph's lifelong dream of discovering new species came to fruition. Over the course of several expeditions, he had identified 18 new reptiles, and he had no intention of stopping. The expedition of September 2001 was supposed to be just another chapter in his career, albeit one filled with unique challenges. Delayed by funding issues and the monsoon season, the team finally set off into the jungle, navigating through thick mud and torrential rains. They battled not just the elements but also the logistical difficulties of conducting research in such a remote location. There were over 90 porters carrying supplies, and Joseph's team included biologists, students, and assistants from Myanmar, all under his careful direction. Despite the obstacles, Joseph's enthusiasm for the job remained infectious. However, according to Mark Moffat, a tropical biologist on the team, there were signs that Joseph was wearing down. The constant rain, the difficult terrain, and the stress of leading such a large team had begun to take a toll. His usual vivacity was noticeably diminished. Still, he pressed on, unaware that on September 11th, his journey would take a tragic turn. It was around 7 a.m. when one of the Burmese field assistants approached Joseph with a specimen bag containing a snake. The assistant explained that a snake of the same species had bitten him the day before, but he believed it was non-venomous. Joseph, familiar with the wide variety of snakes in the area, didn't hesitate. He reached into the bag to handle the creature. As his hands reached inside the bag, the snake struck. The bite was quick, almost imperceptible, but Joseph felt it. He pulled his hand away and looked at the snake, a near-perfect mimic of the multi-banded crate. But this wasn't a mimic, it was a real crate, one of the most venomous species in the world. Its bite carried neurotoxin venom capable of shutting down the body's motor functions and breathing. Joseph processed what had just happened, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Despite the venom's fast-acting nature, Joseph remained remarkably composed. He had faced life-threatening situations before, including an incident where a spitting cobra nearly blinded him, so he relied on his experience and training. He knew the protocol: stay calm, assess the situation, and seek help. Carefully inspecting himself for bite marks, he found none, which reassured him initially. In his characteristic style, Joseph joined his team for breakfast, using humor to ease any tension, cracking jokes as if nothing had happened. However, beneath the lighthearted demeanor, a subtle unease lingered. Hoping to shake off the growing discomfort, he decided to lie down for a nap after breakfast, believing some rest might help him feel better. When he woke at about 8 a.m., the tingling in his arm had spread. His fingers began to tremble and his movements slowed. Joseph recognized the signs of the neurotoxin's effect. He knew this could be fatal if left untreated. His team sprang into action, sending 2 assistants on a frantic journey to the nearest town to call for help. But Myanmar's strict regulations meant there was no satellite phone on site, and the promised radio phone had never arrived. Joseph, ever the scientist, didn't panic. Instead, he calmly predicted what would happen to him next. He explained to his team in writing that they would have to help him breathe if he lost the ability to do so. As the hours passed, Joseph's condition worsened. His breathing became more labored and his speech grew slurred. When he could no longer speak, he wrote messages, including one that advised his team to hold his head upright and warned them that vomiting could be dangerous. The team tried everything they could. 2 more assistants were sent out in search of help, but the torrential rains made travel nearly impossible. Hours passed, and despite their best efforts, the team had no way to get Joseph the help he needed. The heavy rains had made it impossible for a helicopter to land. The team continued to keep Joseph alive, taking turns breathing for him through a simple improvised method. They held him through the night, taking shifts, keeping him alive for 26 hours despite the odds. By the time the helicopter finally managed to reach them, it was too late. Joseph's pulse had already stopped. Despite 3 hours of CPR, there was no reviving him. Joseph Slowinski, a man who had dedicated his life to the study of the very snakes that had ultimately taken his life, passed away in the jungles of Myanmar, far from home. He was 38 years old. The news of his death was a blow to the scientific community, especially those who had known him personally. Joseph had lived his life for the pursuit of knowledge, with a particular love for the creatures that most people feared. His passing marked the loss of a brilliant mind, a passionate educator, and a fearless adventurer. To his team, he was more than just a mentor, he was a friend, a man whose zest for life and nature had inspired them all. It was May 2018, a warm Saturday in Texas. The morning sun had already heated the air as Jeremy Sutcliffe and his wife Jennifer worked together in their newly settled garden. The house was small but cozy, and the garden had been a bit neglected in the chaos of moving. Now that the boxes were finally unpacked, they decided to spend the day getting the yard into shape. It was a peaceful start, or so it seemed. But the unexpected was just moments away. Jennifer knelt beside a row of flower beds, pulling stubborn weeds from the soft soil. Her hands, dirt-streaked from hours of work, moved rhythmically. The scent of fresh earth filled the air, and the sunlight warmed her back as she carefully tended to the plants. Jeremy, meanwhile, was trimming the grass around the yard, checking the newly planted shrubs to make sure they were secure. Every so often, he would glance over at Jennifer, making sure she was okay. He knew about how much this quiet time meant to her, and how she had been looking forward to setting up a relaxing garden space. A few feet from Jennifer, a few small trees lined the side of the house, their thin branches swaying gently in the breeze. The hum of distant traffic was the only sound that broke the peace. The dogs, small terriers, were roaming nearby, seemingly content with the stillness of the morning. Suddenly, Jennifer screamed. Jeremy turned sharply at the sound. He saw her backing away, eyes wide, as something slithered on the ground. His gaze darted to the source of her alarm. A large rattlesnake, its body coiled in the tall grass, was just inches from her feet. Its head was raised, its eyes locked on Jennifer. The rattling sound cut through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Jennifer took slow, cautious steps back, her hands still outstretched, trying to move away without provoking the snake. She called out to Jeremy for help, her voice sharp and urgent. At first, Jeremy thought she had just spotted a harmless garden snake, but as he moved closer, he saw the thick, patterned body of the western diamondback. His eyes locked on the raised head, its triangular shape unmistakable. This wasn't a small, harmless snake, it was a venomous one, and it was in a striking position. Without hesitation, Jeremy grabbed the nearest shovel, his hands steady despite the surge of urgency in his chest. He positioned himself between Jennifer and the snake. The rattle grew louder, warning him to stay away. But there was no choice now, he had to act. It was either his wife or the snake. With a swift, calculating swing, Jeremy aimed for the snake's head. The shovel hit with a sharp thud, severing the head clean from its body. For a moment, the snake's body twitched violently. Its headless form thrashed erratically in the grass, still moving as though it hadn't realized it was dead. Jeremy remained still, his eyes locked on the body, waiting for it to stop. The body twitched one last time and then went still. The rattling ceased. Jennifer, still watching from a safe distance, didn't move. The yard was quiet again, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Jeremy and Jennifer exchanged a look but said nothing. They moved inside, leaving the garden behind. But the incident lingered in their minds, a reminder of the close call. After 10 minutes, the dogs needed to go out, and Jennifer decided it was safe enough. The yard was quiet and the sun was setting, but she didn't want to risk the dogs getting near the dead rattlesnake. She called Jeremy to move it. He nodded and walked to the garden. As he got closer, he saw the snake, motionless and coiled by the fence, seemingly lifeless. Jeremy grabbed the snake by the tail, carefully lowering it into a grocery bag while keeping his distance from its head. But as his hand closed around the snake's head, it struck. Its fangs sank deep into his hand, and venom surged into his veins instantly. Pain shot through his hand and his fingers went numb as the venom burned through his bloodstream. He called out to Jennifer for help, but the situation had already spiraled out of control. Though the snake's body was lifeless in the bag, its head, still alive, had delivered a final vicious strike. Jeremy tried to free his hand, but the snake's grip was relentless. Using his other hand, he attempted to pry it loose, but in doing so, the fangs sank into his finger, releasing another wave of venom. He finally wrenched the snake off and flung it aside, but the damage was done. His vision blurred and the dizziness overtook him. His body grew heavy, his movements sluggish. He turned to Jennifer, his strength slipping away. Without hesitation, Jennifer moved swiftly to Jeremy, assisting him to the car while dialing 911. She conveyed the urgency to the operator, requesting immediate help. With no time to wait for assistance, they began to drive to the hospital. The 30-minute journey stretched on as Jeremy's breathing grew shallow, his body succumbing to the venom's effects. Jennifer kept her focus on the road, maintaining contact with the operator. Midway through the drive, Jeremy's condition worsened. He collapsed and a seizure ensued. Jennifer pulled over near a church and followed the operator's directions to perform CPR until emergency responders arrived. When the ambulance reached them, paramedics swiftly loaded Jeremy inside. On the way to the hospital, his condition worsened significantly. The team decided to stop and transfer him to a waiting helicopter. The airlift brought him to a hospital equipped to handle the escalating crisis, where doctors immediately began intensive treatment. Jeremy's blood pressure dropped sharply and organ failure began. Medical staff administered 26 doses of antivenom over several hours, but his condition showed minimal improvement. As a last resort, doctors induced a coma to stabilize his system. By the following evening, his vital signs improved slightly. Doctors decided to wake him from the coma. Jeremy opened his eyes, weakened but alive. The aftermath of the venom's effects induced severe kidney damage, multiple surgeries, and the amputation of 2 fingers. Despite these challenges, Jeremy survived. A month later, he was discharged from the hospital. Though chronic pain and lasting health issues remained, his survival marked a significant victory over the near-fatal encounter. It was a warm August evening in 2013 when Connor and Noah Barth, 2 young brothers, set off for what they thought would be another carefree day of childhood adventure in their quiet town of New Brunswick, Canada. The air was thick with the scent of summer, and their laughter echoed as they made their way to the nearby apartment of a close friend. Life, full of promise and innocence, seemed endless. Little did they know, this day, which began like any other, would take a tragic turn no one could have anticipated. The boys, with their boundless energy, had spent the day at a local farm feeding animals and exploring the outdoors. It was a day of simple joys. Afterward, they returned to the apartment, eager to relax before heading back home. The apartment, situated above a reptile store called Reptile Ocean, belonged to Jean-Claude Cisse, a man known in the neighborhood for his extensive knowledge of reptiles. It was a small store, nothing remarkable from the outside, but it housed a variety of exotic creatures, each more intriguing than the last. Jean-Claude was a well-meaning man, passionate about the reptiles he cared for. Among them was a massive 13-foot African rock python, a serpent whose presence in the store was awe-inspiring. It was a creature of power, one that commanded both respect and fear. Jean-Claude had taken the snake in years earlier, after it was found by the Canadian Wildlife Service. The snake had been in a search for a new home after being turned down by the nearby Magnetic Hill Zoo in Moncton. The zoo, unable to provide a proper enclosure, had rejected the python, and Jean-Claude, eager to care for the creature, brought it to his store. Jean-Claude had built an elaborate glass tank for the python, one that spanned from the floor to the ceiling of the apartment. The snake, although large, seemed contained. But what Jean-Claude didn't realize was that the province of New Brunswick had laws prohibiting the ownership of such dangerous animals, and he didn't have the necessary permits to house the python. His oversight, along with a series of careless decisions, set the stage for a disaster no one could have imagined. On that fateful evening, after a day filled with laughter and carefree fun, Connor and Noah found themselves in the living room of Jean-Claude's apartment. Jean-Claude, the father of one of their friends, often welcomed the boys to spend time there. His son had already retreated to his bedroom, leaving Connor and Noah alone in the cozy but now silent living room. The day's adventures had worn them out, and they soon drifted off into a peaceful sleep. Unbeknownst to them, a lurking danger was steadily drawing closer, ready to shatter their tranquility. What no one knew was that in the dead of night, the python had managed to escape its enclosure. The snake, after years of captivity, had been quietly plotting its freedom. The glass tank, although sturdy, was not impenetrable. The lid, which had been loosened over time, finally gave way. The python, with remarkable precision, slid out of its enclosure and made its way across the room. The snake moved with silent grace, guided by its instincts, slipping past furniture and obstacles with ease. It was heading for the vent in the ceiling, a vent that had recently been left exposed when Jean-Claude removed the filter cap to clean it. The snake, drawn by some unknown scent, slithered through the ceiling vent. It was a small opening just large enough for the serpent's slender head to squeeze through. But the snake, determined to explore further, pushed its entire body into the duct system, its muscles flexing as it navigated the narrow space. It moved slowly, methodically, without a sound. The ceiling, which had already been under strain from the weight of the snake, was now in danger of giving way. Above the sleeping boys, the snake maneuvered carefully, its massive body bending and shifting within the confined space. The ductwork creaked under the weight, the sound barely audible in the stillness of the night. It was only a matter of time before the ceiling couldn't hold any longer. Suddenly, with a loud crack, the ceiling buckled. The snake, now free from the confines of the vent, fell to the floor with a heavy thud. It landed directly on top of the boys, who were still in a deep sleep, unaware of the danger that had just descended upon them. The python, disoriented but powerful, immediately coiled around the boys. Its body, thick and unyielding, began to tighten with terrifying force. Connor and Noah woke in an instant, their eyes wide with shock as they found themselves trapped beneath the massive coils of the snake. Panic surged through them, but their movements were slowed by the overwhelming power of the python. The creature's grip was relentless, squeezing harder with each passing moment. The boys fought against the constriction, but the snake's strength was too much. Their screams went unheard, swallowed by the weight of the snake's coils. The python's constriction continued, each breath they took becoming more difficult until the room fell silent once again. By morning, when Jean-Claude arrived at the apartment, the silence was deafening. He stepped into the room, his heart racing as he scanned the space. The ceiling had collapsed and the boys lay motionless, their bodies bruised and lifeless beneath the snake's powerful grip. Jean-Claude rushed to them, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life, but it was too late. The boys were gone, their lives stolen by the very creature Jean-Claude had worked so hard to care for. Blood stained the floor and the snake was nowhere to be found. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the small town. Medical examiners confirmed the cause of death, asphyxiation caused by the snake's constriction. The python had wrapped itself around the boys, suffocating them before they could escape. In the wake of the attack, questions began to surface. Was this simply an unfortunate accident, or was there something more at play? The experts suggested that the snake would not typically act aggressively unless it felt threatened. But how could this happen? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Jean-Claude's decisions had played a crucial role in the tragedy. His failure to secure the snake properly, lack of permits, and disregard for safety contributed to the loss. Authorities charged him with criminal negligence, though the case dragged on for years. In 2015, nearly 2 years after the deaths, Jean-Claude stood trial. His defense argued there was no intent to harm, but the evidence told another story. Despite the case against him, in November 2016, a jury found him not guilty. For the Barth family, no verdict could ease the pain of losing Connor and Noah. Their smiles, frozen in time, became painful reminders of lives cut short. What began as a day of adventure ended in heartbreak, leaving a family to mourn the loss of 2 young boys taken too soon. Eugene DeLeon was no stranger to danger. For 60 years, he had spent his life working with snakes, particularly rattlesnakes, creatures that made most people uneasy. But to Eugene, they weren't just dangerous animals, they were beautiful, misunderstood, and worth protecting. His knowledge of reptiles extended beyond snakes. Turtles, lizards, even crocodiles. If it had scales, Eugene was the man to go to. He had spent decades sharing his expertise, traveling across the country, educating people about these often feared creatures. It was May in Texas, and Eugene was back at the Rattlesnake Roundup Festival for the 6th year in a row. The festival, a yearly celebration of rattlesnakes and other reptiles, drew thousands of visitors from all over. It wasn't just a spectacle, it was a platform for education. Eugene was one of the main attractions. His booth, filled with snakes of various sizes, was always crowded. People gathered around to watch him work, fascinated by his calm demeanor as he handled the deadly reptiles with ease. The first day had gone smoothly. Eugene spent hours showing off his prized rattlers, explaining their behavior and teaching the crowd about safety. The sun beat down, the air thick with the sounds of laughter, music, and the occasional hiss of a snake. Eugene was in his element, but as the second day wore on, the crowd began to grow restless. By the afternoon, the festival grounds were packed. The noise was constant, a mixture of shouting vendors, children running around, and the clatter of food stands. The scent of frying food mixed with the dust in the air. Among the many snakes Eugene brought to the festival, one stood out, a massive 8-foot-long rattlesnake that he had been carefully raising for years. It was a creature that demanded respect, and Eugene was proud to show it off. The snake had always been calm in public, but today there was something different about it. As Eugene approached its enclosure, the snake's tongue flicked out rapidly, and its body coiled tighter. Something was off. Eugene noticed it, but he didn't let it show. He moved with the same slow precision he always did, taking the long-handled stick to coax the snake out of its box. The crowd fell silent as he carefully lifted the snake, holding it high for all to see. It seemed almost serene for a moment, its scales glistening in the sunlight, its rattle silent. But then, without warning, it struck. The attack was swift, almost unnoticed by the crowd. The snake struck, its fangs sinking into Eugene's shoulder. A gasp rippled through the onlookers, but Eugene didn't flinch. With the same calm demeanor he always maintained, he gently returned the snake to its box and stepped back from the display. His hand instinctively went to his shoulder. The heat from the venom spread quickly as expected. His shoulder burned intensely and the pain shot down his arm, sharp and unrelenting. Despite the panic stirring in his chest, Eugene remained calm, walking steadily toward the medic station. The chaos of the festival around him seemed distant, his focus narrowing to the searing pain, the rhythmic pulse of his heartbeat, and the growing heaviness in his limbs. It didn't take long for the effects to set in. By the time Eugene reached the medic station, his vision was blurry and his breathing was ragged. The medics moved quickly, but Eugene knew there was little they could do. The venom was already in his system, working its way through his bloodstream. He tried to speak, to warn them, but the words wouldn't come. He could only point to his shoulder, indicating where he'd been bitten. There was no anti-venom at the festival. Eugene knew that well. It wasn't something that could be carried around easily. Anti-venom had to be prepared fresh, and it took hours to produce. Eugene's mind, sharp as ever, knew the reality. his chances of survival were slim. The venom would spread fast and there was nothing anyone could do in time. His chest tightened, his breath became shallow, and his limbs started to go numb. A helicopter arrived within minutes, the roar of its blades cutting through the noise of the festival. The medics lifted Eugene into the air, his body already growing colder as life drained from him. But Eugene never spoke again. His eyes fluttered closed and the world around him faded into darkness. As the helicopter made its way toward the hospital, the festival continued below, unaware of the tragedy unfolding above. The crowds, lost in their excitement, had no idea that one of their own, one of the people who had taught them so much about the very snakes they came to see, was slipping away. Back at the festival, word of Eugene's bite spread slowly. The medics worked tirelessly to keep him stable, but as the hours passed, hope faded. The hospital was ready, but Eugene never regained consciousness. He died in the air, long before the anti-venom could reach him. His death rocked the community. Yet for his family, there were no questions, only the loss of a man who had died doing what he loved. His passing was a tragic reminder of the dangers of the animals he dedicated his life to. Wade Westbrook didn't just love snakes, he lived for them. A lifelong passion that shaped his identity, earning him a reputation as the expert in East Ridge, Tennessee. If you had a snake problem, Wade was your first call. His knowledge was encyclopedic, his enthusiasm infectious, and his confidence in handling even the most dangerous of serpents was unmatched. But on the night of January 29, 2011, Wade's expertise failed him in the most devastating way possible. A simple favor, a routine identification, a snake that should have been harmless until it wasn't. What followed was a tragic sequence of events where hesitation and fear turned a survivable bite into a death sentence. By 2011, Tennessee had recorded an average of 150 venomous snake bites annually, with copperheads accounting for nearly 85% of all reported cases. Despite these numbers, fatalities remained rare. Less than 0.1% of copperhead bites resulted in death. The state's emergency response protocol for snake bites had been refined over decades, with specialized anti-venom units stationed at major hospitals. Yet these statistics assumed immediate medical intervention, a luxury Wade wouldn't receive. This is the story of how the man who had spent his entire life mastering snakes was killed by one. For as long as anyone could remember, Wade was the go-to guy for all things reptilian. At just 26 years old, he had built a reputation far beyond his years, amassing an unparalleled knowledge of Tennessee's native snake population. He was the kind of person who saw beauty where others saw danger, who found wonder in creatures most people feared, even copperheads. Copperheads represent nature's perfect ambush predator. Their strike speed averages 2.98 meters per second, faster than a human can blink. Their heat-sensing pits can detect temperature variations of 0.002 degrees Celsius, allowing them to track prey with microscopic precision. Most importantly, their venom, a complex cocktail of hemotoxins and cytotoxins, begins destroying tissue within minutes of injection. Unlike other pit vipers, copperheads can control their venom output, often delivering warning bites with minimal venom. But when threatened, they can inject up to 150 milligrams of venom, enough to kill small prey instantly. Wade's home on Blandon Drive was more than just a house, it was a private zoo, filled with terrariums and enclosures housing an impressive collection of snakes. Many were legal, but some were not. Tennessee law strictly prohibited the possession of native venomous species in captivity without permits. Even transporting such a snake required extensive paperwork, background checks, and strict safety measures. Wade had none of these. Tennessee's exotic animal laws ranked among America's strictest. By 2011, keeping venomous snakes required a $1,000 annual permit, monthly facility inspections, and proof of $100,000 in liability insurance. Yet the black market thrived. Wildlife officials estimated over 10,000 illegal venomous snakes were kept in Tennessee basements and bedrooms. The previous year alone saw 27 arrests for illegal possession, though experts believed this represented less than 1% of actual violations. But Wade was careful, and everyone knew he had a few venomous creatures hidden away. He had always been one step ahead of the authorities, keeping his collection discreet, ensuring that the wrong eyes never saw what he had behind closed doors. And yet, despite his illegal activities, he had never been in serious trouble. His love for snakes was pure, and in a way, the community respected that. They turned a blind eye because at the end of the day, Wade wasn't just some reckless collector. He was an expert. He knew how to handle them, how to care for them, how to avoid danger. Or so everyone thought. It was a quiet Saturday evening and Wade was at home enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. But peace never lasted long in his world. At 8 p.m. his phone rang. On the other end of the line was a friend, frantic and desperate. He had found a snake in his backyard and needed Wade's expertise. Could he identify it? Was it dangerous? Wade didn't hesitate. He never did. He told his friend to bring the snake over, confident that whatever it was, he could handle it. When his friend arrived, he carried a makeshift enclosure, a plastic container hastily put together holding the writhing creature inside. Wade peered in and immediately knew what he was dealing with. A copperhead. Common, familiar. A snake Wade had encountered dozens of times before. Copperheads were one of the most recognizable venomous snakes in North America. With their distinctive tan bodies, dark hourglass-shaped crossbands, and copper-colored heads, they were easy to identify. And yet, something about this one was off. It was January. Copperheads were supposed to be hibernating this time of year. Why wasn't this one? As Wade studied it, a theory formed in his mind. It was possible that this particular snake had been born late in the season, too small to properly hibernate, too weak to follow its instincts. Or maybe, just maybe, it had once belonged to a collector, someone who had raised it in captivity before releasing it into the wild. But before he could voice his suspicions, his friend interrupted. "Can you tell if it's male or female?" It was an innocent question, a simple request. One Wade had answered countless times before. Without a second thought, he reached into the enclosure and carefully lifted the snake into his hands. And in that moment, his fate was sealed. The strike was so fast, so precise, that Wade barely had time to react. The copperhead's fangs sank deep into the flesh just above his elbow. A perfect hit. For a split second, there was silence. Then reality crashed in. Wade sucked in a sharp breath, his eyes widening as pain flared through his arm. His friend took a step back, panic rising. Wade, though visibly shaken, tried to stay calm. He had been bitten before, he knew the steps to take. Quickly, he placed the snake back into its enclosure, his hands already trembling. The puncture wounds were beginning to swell. He could feel the venom spreading, coursing through his bloodstream. He tried to extract it, pressing his lips against the wound, attempting to suck out the toxin. Nothing. The venom had already moved too deep. Desperate, he grabbed a syringe, preparing to inject himself with a DIY antivenom, a risky, self-administered solution that had saved him in the past. But this time, it failed. His breathing became labored, his vision blurred, he swayed on his feet. For the first time in his life, Wade knew he was in real danger. "Call 911, he whispered, his voice was weak, his strength fading. Then he collapsed onto the couch, and everything went black. His friend stood frozen. If he called for help, paramedics would come, and if paramedics came, they would see. The illegal snakes, the venomous species Wade had been keeping in secret. The entire collection that shouldn't have been there. Fear clouded his judgment. Instead of dialing 911, he grabbed his phone and called a few of Wade's other friends. Within minutes, they arrived, not to help Wade, but to clear out his collection. They moved quickly, removing the evidence, making sure that when authorities arrived, there would be no venomous snakes left to find. 10 minutes. That's how long it took before someone finally made the call. By then, Wade's body was shutting down. When paramedics arrived, they found him unconscious, his pulse faint. CPR was performed immediately, and he was rushed to Erlanger Hospital in Chattanooga. But it was too late. At 26 years old, Wade Westbrook was pronounced dead. Copperhead bites are rarely fatal, but Wade's history of past envenomations may have triggered an allergic reaction, causing his body to go into shock at an accelerated rate. Herpetologist Courtney Lewis later explained, "It depends on where you're bitten and how much venom was injected, but in the end, it's always best to get to the hospital as quickly as possible." Thank you for watching some of the most terrifying snake attacks ever recorded. If you're eager for more, check out the video recommended on your end screen right now. Just click to watch.